everyone, my name is Hailey Elizabeth, and if you don't know who I am, this is my true crime podcast where once a week I sit down and I talk about all things true crime, ranging from murders, disappearances, cults, all the way to the biggest drug bust in history, the biggest bank heist in history, all things true crime. So if you're interested in any of that, you could subscribe to the YouTube channel and watch the visual version every Wednesday, or you could head over to Spotify, Apple, wherever you can find podcasts for the audio version every Tuesday. For today's case, we're going to be talking about the case of Jake Nolan. Now, there is a lot to get through, so we're just going to hop right into it. Jake Nolan was born in New York to his parents, Jim and Debbie Nolan. He also had two older siblings, making him the youngest. He came from a wealthy family in Long Island, and Jake, as a child, was described as very kind and very loving to every person that he met. Jake was the kind of person that, even if people aren't giving you kindness, always give kindness back to them. He was always very, very kind and polite, but when he was 5 years old, that's when he was diagnosed with ADHD, and from there on out, he would continue to struggle with his mental health. At 15 years old, Jake would have really, really bad mood swings and would often skip school just because he had no motivation to get out of bed every morning and go to school, and it was around this time where he was diagnosed with anxiety and depression. And then at 17 years old, Jake was actually hospitalized after one incident where he got into an argument with his parents, and he took a kitchen knife and told his parents that he was going to go upstairs and off himself with the knife, and his parents obviously were very, very scared, and so they called the police and he was admitted into the hospital. It was during this time where he was also diagnosed with bipolar disorder. He graduated high school in 2012 and went on to go to college, and at this point when he was entering college, he was around 17, 18 years old, and he at this point had been prescribed over 30 different medications and none of them were working. And already taking medications is kind of a 50-50 just because of the crazy side effects and things like that. So taking 30 different sorts of drugs is not good for your body, especially when they're not working. And so as a way for Jake to cope with his mental illness, since his prescriptions weren't working, he used alcohol and illegal drugs to cope. And then one day, Jake's father, Jim, receives a call from Jake's college asking if everything was okay with Jake because he hadn't shown up to class in almost 2 weeks. And that's when Jim and Debbie find out that Jake had been skipping class to either lay in bed all day because he was severely depressed or to go out and do drugs. And Jake's parents grew extremely concerned for Jake because Jake at this point was only 19 years old. He was still a teenager with so much life left to live and so much ahead of him. They wanted to help him while he was still young. And so one day, Jake's mother, Debbie, was talking about her situation to her niece, 40-year-old Pamela Buckbinder, and she was basically saying, all the struggles that she's going through with Jake, and she just wants to get him help, but she doesn't know how. And Pamela is actually a very, very well-known and successful psychiatrist in the state of New York. She was very well known and had tons of awards to show for it. And so she tells Debbie, hey, why doesn't Jake just live with me for a couple of months, sort of as like a free rehabilitation center, and he can basically just stay with me. I'll give him regular therapy sessions. I'll keep track of his medication use to make sure that, he's taking his meds. I can give him frequent alcohol and drug tests to make sure that he's staying clean. And Pamela said that she would take Jake in if Jake helped her out with her 4-year-old son, Calder. And to this, Debbie, of course, said yes, because Pamela and Jake, since they were first cousins, they had a close relationship to begin with. And Jake even later on said himself, quote, "Pamela and I formed a relationship when I was really young. This is my cousin. This is someone I really knew. And I entrust everything into this one woman. I mean, this woman is gonna save my life." And so that is when Jake himself even agreed. Jake said, I am young. I'm only a teenager. I need the help, and I understand that this is affecting my life in a negative way. And so Jake agreed to live with Pamela for a couple of months and get the help that he needed, and in return he would take take care and help out Pamela with her 4-year-old son, Calder. Now, a little bit of backstory on Pamela Buckbinder. Pamela was a practicing psychiatrist from Manhattan and a single mother of her 4-year-old son, Calder. But her relationship with Calder's father, who was Dr. Micheal Weiss, who was also a famous psychiatrist, her relationship with Calder's father was very, very rocky. And a lot of the family and friends of Pamela and Micheal would say that their relationship had been very toxic since day one. They would fight very often. Their relationship would go, in and out. One minute they were super lovey with one another. The next minute they were screaming and angry at one another. One minute Pamela was, welcoming Micheal in, while the next minute she was kicking him out. And there were a couple of times where the arguments even turned physical, where Pamela was actually arrested after throwing a glass cup at Michael's head, causing him to bleed and leading him to go to the hospital. There was also another time where Micheal was arrested after Pamela had called the police because Micheal had threatened to assault her. Now, a lot of people aren't really sure if this claim is correct or not, just because, we have seen Pamela physically harm Micheal in the past, whereas when Micheal just threatens Pamela, that's when she calls the police. And later, as we go along and you see Pamela's behavior, you will probably think the same as well. So as I said, the couple had Calder back in 2008, but they did split up in 2009, leading Pamela to raise Calder on her own, to which she moved from Manhattan to Greenwich Village. In 2011 is when Pamela and Micheal had started their custody battle over Calder, and throughout the entire custody battle, Pamela was just extremely petty to Micheal. She would often tell Calder all of these lies about Micheal, about how he is a terrible husband, he's a terrible father, and he says all these terrible things, basically trying to turn Calder against his own father so that Pamela would win the custody battle for him. And not only would she try to turn Calder against his own father, she would also have Calder as like her little spy, and she would have him, find out secret info about Micheal and then use that info against him in court. And then a year later, in 2012, is when they agreed to have joint custody. So Pamela would get Calder during the weeks and Micheal would have the weekends. But one of Pamela's requirements for joint custody was that Micheal must maintain a $1.5 million life insurance policy. And on top of that, she wanted Calder to be the beneficiary and she wanted herself to be the trustee. And Micheal agreed to this. And I'm assuming Micheal agreed to this because he just felt so drained and tired after this custody battle. As you could see, the way that Pamela is, it's very hard for Pamela not to get her way because she does the most in order to get what she wants. And so I'm assuming Micheal just kind of agreed to keep his life insurance policy at 1.5 million, just as a way of like, okay, if this is what I have to do to see my son, then this is what I'm gonna have to do. That's where Pamela was in her life when Jake came to move in. When Jake moved in, Pamela and Micheal were still in their custody battle. They hadn't like agreed on joint custody yet. So that was currently happening when Jake moved into her home. But with Jake moving in with Pamela, it was said that Jake actually started to change for the better when he moved in with Pamela. He started to feel a lot better about himself and his life and even developed a closer bond with Pamela. I would say that his main issues ever since he was a kid was that he struggled a lot with self-doubt and feeling like his good wasn't good enough no matter how hard he worked, and he struggled to really find purpose and a need to be on earth. With Pamela having this very close relationship with Jake, that is when she granted Jake the title to be a godfather to Calder. And so since Jake was given this new godfather title, to him this was, his purpose. He had finally felt like he had purpose again, like he was needed and that someone needed him. And this was a very, very big deal to him because, as I said, he was very depressed and anxious and very low and vulnerable. So something like this meant a lot to him. And so he made Calder his entire life. He would take care of Calder as if he was his own son. Jake would even later on say, quote, "This was a kid that I loved more than my life." When you look at this situation from an outside perspective, this just more seems like an empty gesture on Pamela's part. And if anything, this more just looks like Pamela's first attempt at gaining Jake's trust. I don't think Pamela actually trusted Jake with Calder. You know, like, being a godfather is a pretty big deal. That means if something happens to the parents, then you would be the parent to that child. And Jake, at this point in his life, as I said, the whole reason he was going to Pamela's was because he was dealing with substance abuse and anxiety and depression and trying to just heal himself. And I don't think Pamela, especially being a psychiatrist, would, you know, put her son in the hands of someone that is not mentally well enough right now to have a child. And so to this, it just seemed like Pamela was trying to gain Jake's trust and make him believe that, you know, by serving Calder, he's also serving Pamela, and thus making Pamela and Calder his whole life and his whole purpose. And then on November 12th of 2012, on this day, Micheal actually had Calder for the day, and so he was feeling extremely excited to being able to spend the day with his son. So on this day, he got his son ready, took him to daycare, and then afterwards went back home to his home office and meet with his first client of the day, because as I said, he is also a psychiatrist. Sitting down with his first client of the day, and midway through the therapy session, that is when Jake Nolan busts through the door carrying a duffel bag and looking in extreme distress. Now, Micheal knew of Jake because he knew that Jake was staying with Pamela due to all of his mental health issues at the time, but he didn't really know him like too personally, but nonetheless, he was aware of Jake's mental health issues and knew, you know, maybe something was wrong. So Micheal basically just told Jake, you know, I'm in a therapy session right now. Do you mind waiting outside the room? And then when I'm done, me and you can talk about whatever you want to talk about. So that's exactly what he did. Jake waited outside while Micheal finished his session. And when the session was over, Micheal went out to the waiting room and saw that Jake was still there with his duffel bag. Jake said that he was there to collect some financial aid documents for Calder's preschool, and Micheal was like, yeah, I got those papers, like, come on in, come into my office. But Micheal at first did request Jake to leave his duffel bag in the waiting room and not bring it into the office, just because Micheal was a little scared of Pamela, and he knew, you know, Pamela would go as far as bugging his place or placing some sort of like recording device just to try to catch him in the act of saying something he's not supposed to say. So this was just out of fear that Pamela was up to something. But to this, Jake refused. He said that he couldn't leave his duffel bag out there for some reason, but Micheal didn't pry. He was just like, okay, whatever, like, I'll probably just get the place swept after you leave to make sure there's no bugs. And so Micheal and Jake go to Michael's office. When in Michael's office, that is when Jake asks him if he could go to the bathroom, and so he did. But then when he came out of the bathroom, that is when he charged at Micheal with a 10-pound sledgehammer. Micheal, thank God, was very quick to dodge this very deadly blow, but it did unfortunately hit his shoulder. So when Jake had missed, he lost control of the sledgehammer, because swinging around a 10-pound sledgehammer is not an easy thing to do because the end of it is so heavy. It's very hard to maneuver if you're not used to it. And so to this, he threw the sledgehammer to the side, pulled out a knife from the duffel bag, and started to wildly stab Micheal multiple times in the legs, the arm, the neck, the stomach. Micheal did not go down without a fight. Micheal fought off Jake, and Micheal was also a lot bigger than Jake. Micheal was 6'3" and 205 pounds, so it was gonna have to take a lot to bring him down. Micheal was indeed able to gain control of the knife and stab Jake in the collarbone, but when Micheal does this, he looks down at the knife and he recognizes the knife, and he remembers that this is a knife that he gave to Pamela as part of a knife set for Christmas, meaning that Pamela was involved in this. So when he sees this, he runs out of his apartment and into the hall, and he starts yelling for help, with Jake following right beside him. All of this commotion obviously lets neighbors, you know, crowding around Micheal, trying to figure out what happened, crowding around Jake, trying to figure out what happened. Halfway through the hallway, that is when Micheal had passed out due to all of the blood that he was was losing, and so the neighbors immediately called the police. But as the police were on their way, neighbors noticed a very odd behavior towards Jake, in that literally as Jake is sitting in this hallway bleeding out with Micheal dying right beside him, he decides to whip out his phone and snap a quick selfie of himself, just like covered in blood, like freshly stabbed. He just takes a quick picture of himself and he sends it off to Pamela before the police arrive. So the paramedics and the police show up. They're trying to figure out what happened, and so since Jake is conscious and Micheal isn't, they go to Jake for information, and Jake actually lies to the police. Jake tells the police that Micheal was the one that attacked him and that he was trying to fight off Micheal, but the police would find out pretty quickly afterwards, after looking at the crime scene and even talking to neighbors. The neighbors were like, yeah, Micheal came out here and he was bleeding a lot and he was yelling for help while that kid was in the corner literally just taking pictures of himself. Like, if anything, like, I'm pretty sure that kid did something to Micheal. And so the police figured it out pretty quickly of what was actually going on. Nonetheless, they sent Jake and Micheal off to the hospital. As far as the crime scene itself, they did recover the sledgehammer, and when doing testing on it, they found Jake's DNA on it, meaning Jake was the one that was in control of this sledgehammer. They also found that Michael's shoulder injury had lined up with being hit with the sledgehammer. They also recovered the kitchen knife and found that it was indeed the same exact knife from Pamela's kitchen block, and when they went to Pamela's place, they found that the same exact knife that was used on Micheal was the same exact knife that was missing from Pamela's kitchen block, so from that they knew that this was Pamela's knife. They also collected Jake's duffel bag, and in there they found a pack of cigarettes, zip ties, a Home Depot bag, 2 pillows, and a hand-drawn map of Micheal's building with 2 separate circles around both of the entrances of the building, as well as a line going from one entrance to another, sort of as if you're mapping out an escape route. They found that this Home Depot bag came from a Home Depot on West 23rd Street in Chelsea, New York. Now, this is just kind of a side comment, but when I looked at this Home Depot, this is the fanciest Home Depot I've ever seen in my life. Like, I didn't even think this was an actual Home Depot. Crazy side note, but I just thought that was a little wild. When the police had gotten access to the security footage from this Home Depot, what they found was that the night before, they saw Jake purchasing a sledgehammer, a 10-pound sledgehammer that was found at the crime scene, as well as zip ties, the same zip ties that was found in the duffel bag. But in the security footage, Jake was not alone, but Pamela was right next to him. And not only was Pamela there, she was paying for all of these materials in cash. So that means that that night, while Micheal is, having a great time spending time with his son, Pamela was at Home Depot buying materials in order to murder Micheal the next day. So going back to the story where currently Jake and Micheal are in the hospital. Now, Jake was easily able to just, be stitched up and sent home. As for Micheal, though, thank God he did survive this, and all he needed was a couple of stitches, same thing as Jake. But although when Micheal was released, he was sent home, Jake was not sent home. He was arrested, but he was released on a $200,000 bail, and for some reason, even though he was awaiting his murder trial, they still allowed him to fly to Miami to visit his parents, because as I said, his family was from Long Island, but during the years his family, specifically his parents, decided to move to Miami, Florida, and the court had allowed him to live in Miami while awaiting trial. Don't worry, it's still me, just now in sponsorship mode, thanking the sponsor of today's episode, HelloFresh. Now, if you guys don't know what HelloFresh is a monthly subscription service that offers farm fresh, pre-portioned ingredients and seasonal recipes delivered right to your doorstep. Skip trips to the grocery store and count on HelloFresh to make home cooking easy, fun, and affordable. That's why it's America's #1 meal kit. Get farm-to-table quality with every HelloFresh box. HelloFresh's seasonal ingredients are picked at peak ripeness and travel from the farm to your doorstep in less than 7 days for fresh flavor in every bite. And not only is HelloFresh more convenient than grocery shopping, it's also a lot cheaper, exactly 25% less cheaper than takeout. Personally, I love HelloFresh. With HelloFresh, it's not only helped my bank account so that I can, save money on ordering out and also just, cooking at home. It's definitely helped me cook a lot better in general. I feel like with HelloFresh, you're getting ingredients that typically you wouldn't really use. I remember for this one recipe I did a while back for like a certain sandwich, I had to use red wine vinegar, and I never used red wine vinegar, but now it's something that I literally put into all of my sauces because I've just learned that I loved it. So HelloFresh has definitely helped me, expand my horizons when it comes to cooking. And if you guys want HelloFresh for yourself, all you need to do is go to hellofresh.com/behind16 and use code behind16 for 16 free meals plus free shipping. And thank you once again to HelloFresh for sponsoring today's episode. Now back to your episode. But unfortunately, while awaiting trial, Jake's mental health just got worse and worse and even attempted to off himself multiple times. At first, Jake told the police that it was all self-defense and that it was actually Micheal that took the sledgehammer out of his duffel bag and hit him with it, but that made no sense to Jake's injuries, as well as why was Jake just carrying around a sledgehammer, especially like breaking into Michael's apartment with all of this suspicious weapons and equipment. And so quickly Jake realized that all of his lies were catching up to him, and that is when he started to slowly tell the full story of what happened. And he said that Pamela was to blame, that Pamela was the one that brainwashed him into the murder of Michael. But for some reason, the police didn't believe this. The police didn't believe that Michael hit Jake, but they also didn't believe that Pamela had brainwashed him either. Now, I'm assuming why they thought like this in the beginning was due to Pamela, because as I said, Pamela was Jake's psychiatrist, and Jake has a history of, suicidal thoughts and depression and anxiety. So I'm assuming Pamela probably told the police that Jake was not mentally okay and that he was probably having an episode or something, just to basically deflect all of the brainwashing claims. But as you will see later from actual evidence, what Jake is saying is the truth. And then in November of 2013, the following year, Michael Weiss had actually attempted at suing both Pamela and Jake, saying that Pamela had forced him into making his life insurance policy $1.5 million, and then 4 days later attempting to murder him. As I said, when Jake moved into the house, Pamela and Michael were going through this custody battle, but 4 days after they had agreed on joint custody and the insurance policy agreement, 4 days after that is when Jake had burst into Michael's room and attempted to murder him. Michael's lawyer even brought in a forensic expert to analyze the map that was found in Jake's duffel bag, and found, when comparing to Pamela's handwriting and the handwriting on the map, that this map was indeed drawn by Pamela. Now, when Pamela was asked about this, she just said that she just drew the map because she wanted to make sure that Jake knew where to go on the days that he needed to pick up Calder from Michael. But they also found through phone records that Pamela had been in contact with Jake before and after the attempted murder. As I said earlier, Jake had taken a picture of himself and sent it off to Pamela, and when he did, he basically sent a bunch of texts afterwards saying that the plan had failed and that he was hurt. And then a while later, when he was taken to the hospital, he sent off another text to Pamela saying, quote, "In hospital, please come. Michael bleeding badly. Same. I walked into office. He stabbed me with knife in the heart." After this, Pamela just replies with, quote, "Where?" And that's it. She doesn't show any concern for Michael, doesn't show any concern for, Jake. When Pamela had showed up to the hospital, that is when Jake was talking to the police, and Jake had told the police, quote, "There was no plan for after the attack. I think it was Pamela's plan just to dismiss me. Oh man, he tried to kill him. He lost. Try again later. I really believe it was her plan to try again. Jake's family lawyer, who was helping Jake out with everything, had actually put a restraining order or like a restriction on Pamela and Jake from seeing each other. Jake's family blamed Pamela and said that Pamela was the reason that their son was stabbed and almost killed, with Jake's family saying, quote, her overall belief that it was appropriate to deprive this child of his father's guidance and affection can only be viewed as evidencing the mother's total indifference to this child's well-being. And so now that all of the fingers are being pointed at Pamela, it was clearly Pamela's idea. This was something that, she wanted to do. She had every motive in the world to have Micheal dead, and it would make sense that she would send Jake to do it because, as I said, Jake was a vulnerable 19-year-old kid. The whole reason why he was staying with Pamela is because he was not well, and when someone is so vulnerable, they are easier to manipulate. Even after all of this, and even after Jake told police that Pamela was the reason that he did what he did, Pamela was never arrested. She was never taken into questioning. She didn't have Calder taken away from her. And on top of all of that, her medical license was never put into jeopardy. So that means after Pamela had orchestrated a murder on her ex and used one of her clients to complete that murder, she was still, meeting with people and diagnosing her patients and giving out medications and giving advice to her patients. Like, she was still actively working while all of this was going on. It was actually Pamela herself who shut down her own practice due to all of the backlash that she was getting online. So it's not like, she was forced to shut down her practice. That was a personal choice of her to do so. Although Jake was manipulated by Pamela, Jake did not deflect from any blame. He completely owns up to his actions, and he says that at the end of the day, he is the one who, tried to hurt Micheal and did hurt Micheal. And so because of that, he's ready to face any consequences of those actions. But although it was him completing the action, he still claimed that Pamela was the ringleader, she was the manipulator, and Jake told police that Pamela told Jake to murder Micheal, and if he was successful, they would take the insurance policy money and basically just live off of that, and that Pamela didn't have to work anymore and she didn't have to share custody anymore. And Michael's lawyer even came out and said, quote, my client is concerned about the safety and well-being of his child, and that's why he filed an action in family court. We assumed that shortly after the incident, the responsible parties would be prosecuted and appropriate action would be taken. Now that this has not happened nearly 2 years later. So in 2015, 2 years later, nothing has went down. Pamela is still in custody of Calder, which, if I was in Michael's position, I would not feel comfortable giving my son away to a woman who literally hired a hitman on me. Like, I don't want my child anywhere near that woman. Again, if she wanted to get back into psychiatry and practice it again, she could 100% do that. And although Pamela was basically getting off everything completely free, Jake was still in Miami awaiting his murder charges. But while Jake was in Miami and while awaiting trial, that is when he was given real therapy and real help. And it wasn't until he started receiving this real therapy and real help where he started to really come to terms with and realize all of the abuse that Pamela was doing to him. He said that when he first started living with Pamela, everything was completely fine. Him and Pamela, it was business per usual. Pamela would give him regular therapy sessions, and in these therapy sessions, he realized that for most of his life, he was riddled with a lot of self-doubt, identity issues, feeling unworthy and unimportant. And it was after, confessing all of these feelings to Pamela when he was given the godfather title to her son Calder. And he said that when he was given this title of being a godfather and given the responsibility of Calder, he felt extremely high about himself. He felt that, he was needed, that he was appreciated, and and he of course gravitated towards something that gave him purpose, and his purpose was Calder. And if his purpose was Calder, that means he would also get closer with Pamela. Now, this is a type of behavior that you see a lot in cults. A lot of times, people who enter cults before actually getting into it, they're very broken, they're very confused, there's something going on with their lives beforehand, something that they're dealing with, and then when they find something or someone that gives them purpose, that makes them feel good, they tend to gravitate towards that thing, whether it be good or bad. And that's exactly what was happening with Jake and Pamela. He then realized through, looking back on everything, that he was a lot more involved in Pamela's life than he should have, and he was given unreasonable responsibilities. He took care of Calder full time, basically. He would take care of Calder, he would feed him, he would bathe him, he would clean Calder's room, he would clean the house in general as like a maid, and he was also always there for Pamela. He supported her, he was her ride or die, and this is very unhealthy for Jake and Pamela to have this relationship, because on top of all of that, Pamela was Jake's psychiatrist. That means Pamela was the only person that Jake had to give him guidance, whether it be good guidance or bad guidance. There was no one there to smack some common sense into Jake, because his common sense was Pamela's common sense. And as well as Pamela being in charge of everything in Jake's life, she was in charge of, the way that Jake thought. She was in charge of his medications and how much he was taking. She was in charge of, what Jake was doing. Later on, there was actually a photo that resurfaced of Jake and Pamela laying in bed together with their son Calder, kind of acting as if they were like a happy family. I don't know about you guys, but I don't really be like laying down with my cousins like this, especially of the opposite gender. And to this photo, Jake said, quote, "I guess that just goes to show you the level of comfort I really felt there. It was not unusual in the morning for her to invite me into bed with Calder and I, and to just share that familiar moment, just really feel like a family together." So now that Jake was, really looking at this situation from the outside, he really started to realize all of the abuse that he was being put under, and his new therapist actually said, quote, "Jake wants a normal life. He wants to be a successful, respected family man with a nuclear family and happy life." So it seems like now that Jake had been given distance from Pamela, that he really started to realize what he wanted for himself, and he's now being, taken away from all of the abuse that was really hard to see when you're in the abuse. And it was very, very clear that Pamela's intentions wasn't just to, get Jake's life back on track, or this wasn't her intention to just be a therapist or just be a psychiatrist, because later on Jake would reveal phone conversations where Pamela would text Jake and call him pet names such as, quote, "Lovey" and "Sweet J," or even love bomb Jake altogether and say things like, quote, "You are the most beautiful and brilliant person I've ever met," as well as, quote, "I have so many thoughts about you throughout the day. I miss you. I think about you all day, and I miss you when we're apart." Now, obviously, those aren't things that you just text your therapist. Those are clearly things that you text a spouse, meaning that this was not just, Pamela trying to help Jake. This was definitely more than that. And Pamela, the 40-year-old woman, should have seen that, hitting on your teenage cousin is probably not a good thing to do. But it was also revealed that Pamela attempted to do to Jake the exact same thing as what she was doing to Calder, in that she was trying to turn Jake against Micheal. She would tell Jake all these lies about Micheal. She would say how Micheal used to physically abuse her all the time, and she even said that Micheal had SA'd Calder multiple times, and that's why she was trying to get full custody of Calder. She also told Jake that Micheal was refusing to pay child support, and that there was no one in this world to help her. But this was later proven wrong because they could easily see from receipts that Micheal was indeed paying Pamela. Pamela was receiving the child support. It was going into her bank account every month. So like that was just a complete lie. But Jake obviously believed Pamela because he had no reason not to believe Pamela. Pamela was his entire life. Pamela was the person that he trusted the most. And he even said at court, quote, "I would have done anything for Pamela. It happened so slowly that you don't really recognize this growing feeling inside of you, that one day you wake up and say, I will kill for this woman." Now, I know a lot of people can say that, Jake, he did have a choice. When he was sitting in that waiting room, he had all the time in the world to think about his actions and turn around and do what was right. In that situation, and when you are in that mindset and you are so deeply manipulated and abused by someone, it's very, very hard to just snap out of it. It's definitely a lot easier said than done. It was a choice that he made, but in his position, he felt like he had no other choice. It was not easy for him to just go home to Pamela without having done anything. He knew for a fact that if he didn't do this and he just went home to Pamela, Pamela would definitely tell Jake to go out and try again. There was no way to get out of this. And he was also too scared to, tell his family and friends about what was going on because he loved Pamela so much and didn't want anything bad to happen to her. So he basically just had to do what he had to do. That doesn't mean that Jake is trying to shy away from any responsibility from what he did. As I said, Jake was very conscious of his actions. He knew that what he did was wrong. He says that although he did attempt at murdering Micheal, he did not have the urge to murder someone. He did not want to murder someone on his own, but it was through the manipulation of Pamela that made him do it. Pamela was the only person he really talked to every single day, and so Pamela's opinions and thoughts were also his opinions and thoughts. So then in March 2016 is when the actual trial had began, and that is when we would find the full story of what happened on November 12th, 2012. Jake said that Pamela had woken him up that morning by rubbing his back and telling him how much she loved him. He said that afterwards they had breakfast, and throughout the entire breakfast, Pamela kept on love bombing him and telling him things that he was the greatest person ever, he was her savior, and no one besides Jake understood her. He said that the night before, on November 11th, they had purchased a sledgehammer and zip ties from Home Depot, and the whole reason why they bought zip ties in the first place was because Pamela actually wanted Jake to torture Micheal before killing him. Jake said in court, quote, "She had already told me that she wanted me to hit him over the head, playing Maxwell's Silver Hammer by the Beatles repeatedly in the house. Pamela was determined for me to, torture Micheal before killing him. She wanted me to inject him with some poisonous chemicals. She wanted me to burn him alive in front of a group of people." And so obviously Jake did not follow through on this torture. I'm assuming just because he was scared for his life and didn't know what to do. Jake said that while Pamela was packing up the duffel bag, she was crying hysterically and even said, quote, "Today is the day. Life is going to be so much better after Micheal is terminated." Jake did say that Pamela was the one that packed the duffel bag. She put in a sledgehammer, the zip ties, the pillows, the everything, even the map. And so that is when Jake took the duffel bag and went off to Michael's home in order to murder him. He said that when he got there, he went through the business entrance of the building, and from security footage, you clearly see Jake coming through the doors. He had no attempt in trying to conceal his identity, and when he signed into the building, he signed in using his real name. And when the court had asked him, why didn't you try to cover your face or your identity? Why would you, walk in using your own name even though you were about to murder someone? And to this, Jake says, quote, I signed in with my own name. Remember, I was willing to die for this woman. I wasn't trying to hide anything. And then from there, that is when Jake walked up to Michael's apartment with the duffel bag full of items, and he bust through Michael's office door, but then quickly realized that Michael was in the middle of a session, to which he felt very, stunned. He didn't know that this was going to happen, and that is when Michael told Jake to wait outside until the session was over, and that's what he did. Jake said that when he was sitting there, he did have a moment where he wanted to rethink the entire situation and he wanted to go home, but to this he said, quote, "I couldn't go back to Pamela without this done. I felt like I had no choice." And at the time, Jake couldn't realize that things with Pamela, no matter how much he tried, was never going to go in his favor. Even if he didn't commit this attempted murder, this would definitely end up with either Pamela just outright grooming Jake to the point where Jake did anything that Pamela said, or Michael would actually end up dead. When Jake had met Pamela for the first time, Jake was broken, and Pamela was the one that put Jake back together. But when she did, she molded Jake to be sort of a weapon for her way out of this, custody battle with Michael. So since Pamela was taking care and trying to mold Jake to be whatever she wanted him to be, this literally drove Jake insane, and just believing all of these lies that Pamela told him, doing everything that Pamela told him to do just for the feeling of, being worthy and being important and needed, because that is what he craved so much. Jake was examined by 2 doctors, and the one doctor said that Pamela knew how to manipulate Jake and transformed him into a weapon that she can control. However, the other doctor argued that Jake was in control of his actions and had the choice whether or not to follow through with the attempted murder of Michael. Because this doctor had asked Jake, well, Pamela wanted you to torture Michael. Why didn't you end up torturing Michael? And Jake said, well, I didn't torture Michael because I couldn't bring myself to do it. I just couldn't do it. And the doctor says, oh, well, so you made the choice not to torture Michael. So that means you could have easily made the choice to not attempt at murdering Michael either. Jake's lawyer reminds the court that Pamela was the mastermind manipulator and had every motive to kill Michael because, as I said, Jake came from money. Jake came from a very wealthy family. He was very easily able to pay off his $200,000 bail. So money wasn't a motive for him. It's not something that he needed or really wanted. This was all simply Pamela's plan. Pamela was the one that would gain the most with Michael dead. She would not only get a $1.5 million life insurance policy, she would also, be able to retire, and she didn't have to work. She didn't have to share custody over Calder anymore. It could simply just be her, Jake, and her child. But nonetheless, in the end, Jake was found guilty of this crime and was sentenced to 9.5 years in prison, while Pamela got to walk free. But Pamela did not get to walk free for too long, because the following year, on October 19th of 2017, that is when Pamela was arrested at her friend's house in Syracuse, New York, and was charged with the second-degree attempted murder and first-degree attempted assault of Michael Weiss. And apparently, it was actually pretty hard for the police to find Pamela, because the police had actually given Pamela 3 different opportunities to surrender and turn herself in, to which she had declined all of those offers. And so the police tried to look for her to arrest her. And so they ended up going to 3 different locations, because Pamela, as like an emergency contact, had given the police 3 addresses. And so when the police showed up at those 3 addresses, she was nowhere to be found. They even tried to contact Pamela's phone number and her work phone with absolutely no response. And it wasn't until the police were able to track Pamela's phone that they found that she had been hopping around in Massachusetts. And when she was found with a backpack of a bunch of materials that would, allege to her trying to run away. They found her passport, her birth certificate, and her son Calder's passport, which was expired. Found out that Pamela was actually on her way to Fayetteville, New York. For those who don't know, Fayetteville, New York is very close to the Canadian border, so it was believed that Pamela was trying to flee to Canada with Calder. Then on October 20th of 2017, Pamela had pled not guilty, and the prosecutors tried to argue that Pamela not have a bail set out. They said that Pamela had tried to run away while they were trying to arrest her, and so it would make sense that Pamela would try to run away again if she was given bail. And Pamela, very similar to Jake, grew up with a lot of money, and so she would easily be able to pay up to a $1 million bond without any penalty to her financial standing. Pamela currently had $1.6 million in real estate, as well as Pamela's mother. Pamela's mother said that she would sell her Florida vacation home in order to pay for Pamela's bail. So it seemed like either way, if Pamela was given bail, she was definitely going to leave. And the court even said, quote, "The defendant is charged with the orchestrating each step of a brutal attack on the father of her child, from purchasing the sledgehammer used to strike the victim to drawing a map depicting the easiest entrance to his home office. Pamela Buckbinder is alleged to have played an integral role in this vicious assault, which, were it not for concerned neighbors and responding NYPD officers, could have easily turned fatal." And then on September 7th of 2022, that is when, at 52 years old, Pamela had pleaded guilty to avoid a 25-year sentence. But on October 11th, 2022, she tried to withdraw that guilty plea, claiming that at the time of her recent plea, where she had pled guilty, she was not on her medication, and she also claimed to be secondhand high from synthetic weed that was being smoked on like the holding office and the transport bus. She also said that that day she was maced by guards as well, so her vision was very blurry and she couldn't read the papers that she was signing. But the court declined all of this and sentenced her to 11 years in prison and 5 years of parole, as well as her medical license finally being revoked. Jake, to this day and at this moment, is still in prison living out his sentence and should be released in the year 2025 at the age of 30 years old. Pamela, at this moment, is currently still serving out her sentence and is to be released in the year 2028 at the age of 56 years old. Yeah, that is the end of today's case. If you guys found this case interesting, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you're on YouTube. If you want to follow me on any of my socials, like my Instagram, that will be linked down below, as well as my PO box if you want to send me anything. That's all from me. I would love to hear what you guys think about the case down below. Let me know your thoughts and opinions about the case. Do you think Pamela should have been, charged at the same time Jake had been charged? Do you think Pamela is more to blame or less to blame? Do you think that if Jake actually turned around and went home, Pamela would have accepted it, or Pamela would have just forced him to go out and try it again? Or do you even think Jake is to blame at all? Do you think that he was a vicious murderer, or do you think he was just a manipulated and vulnerable teenager that was, manipulated by Pamela to commit a heinous act? That is all from me. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Make sure to be safe out there. I love you, I love you, I love you, and I will see you guys next week. Bye.